The courtroom was so silent you could hear a pin drop. All eyes were glued to the large screen in front of the judge's bench. The footage had been hidden for months, buried beneath fabricated police reports and false testimonies. But now it was playing for everyone to see. It showed Officer Grant in his patrol car, speaking angrily into his radio. "We can't let this punk talk," his voice snarled. "Do what you have to do to shut him up. I'll handle the reports." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged horrified glances. The judge's gavel trembled in her hand. But it was the boy in the witness box who stole the attention. 17-year-old Luke Walters, his hoodie slightly too big for his skinny frame, leaned forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You try to bury me," Luke said, his voice firm despite the weight of the moment. But the truth always comes out. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The defense attorney stood frozen, his face pale. Officer Grant, sitting at the defendant's table, slammed his fists down, shouting something no one could hear over the uproar. And just as the judge raised her gavel to call for order, Luke dropped the bombshell. "That's not all the footage," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "There's more, and it's worse." The crowd stilled, hanging on his words, as the judge demanded, "Explain yourself, young man." Luke took a deep breath. "You're going to want to see this next tape." 2 months earlier, Luke was just another homeless kid on the streets of Denver. He'd been kicked out of his foster home after an argument turned physical. With nowhere to go and no one to trust, he wandered the cold city streets, living off scraps and sleeping in alleys. One rainy evening, Luke huddled under a bridge, shivering in the thin hoodie he wore. That's when he met Jasmine, a sharp-tongued girl his age who lived in a rundown shelter nearby. Jasmine had been homeless longer than Luke and knew the ropes. She taught him which diners were generous with leftovers and which alleyways were safest to sleep in. One night, Jasmine and Luke were scrounging through a dumpster behind a deli when they heard voices. They froze, crouching low as 2 men in uniform stepped into view. Officer Grant and his partner, Officer Reyes. They were arguing, their voices sharp and angry. "I told you to leave him alone," Reyes said, his voice strained. "He's just a kid. And I told you to shut up and do your job," Grant snapped back. "You think anyone's going to care about some homeless punk? He doesn't even exist on paper." Luke's blood ran cold. Were they talking about him? Jasmine grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. The officers walked off, but Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, he noticed Officer Grant hanging around the spots where homeless kids gathered, always watching, always waiting. Kids started disappearing, their belongings left behind like they'd vanished into thin air. One night, Luke woke up to find Grant standing over him, his face hard and cold. "Move along," Grant barked. "This is no place for a kid like you." Luke didn't argue. He grabbed his backpack and ran, but the encounter left him shaken. He told Jasmine, but she brushed it off. "Cops are always messing with us," she said. "That's just how it is." But Luke couldn't let it go. He started watching Grant, following him when he could. One night, Luke spotted him meeting with a man in a dark SUV. He crept closer, hiding behind a stack of crates, and recorded the conversation on his phone. "Everything's set," Grant said, his voice low. "The kid's got no one to back him up. We'll pin it on him, just like the others." The man in the SUV nodded. "Good. Make it clean. We don't need any loose ends." Luke's heart pounded. He didn't know who they were talking about, but he knew he had to get that recording to someone who could help. He showed Jasmine, but she laughed bitterly. "You really think anyone's going to believe a couple of homeless kids over a cop? Forget it, Luke. You'll just get yourself killed." But Luke couldn't forget. He found an old laptop at a shelter and uploaded the video to an anonymous email account, sending it to every news station and advocacy group he could think of. That's when the threats started. Luke began finding notes in his hiding spots. "Stay quiet or else." Once, he came back to find his few belongings torn to shreds. Jasmine begged him to drop it, but Luke refused. "If we don't speak up, who will?" he said. One night, while walking back to the shelter, a car swerved onto the sidewalk, nearly hitting him. Luke dove out of the way, landing hard on the pavement. As the car sped off, he caught a glimpse of the driver. It was Grant. Luke knew he couldn't stay on the streets anymore. He turned himself into a local advocacy group, handing over his evidence and telling them everything. They connected him with a lawyer, and soon the case against Grant was building. But Grant wasn't going down without a fight. His lawyers claimed the video was doctored, and without more evidence, the case might not hold. That's when Luke remembered something Jasmine had said. Cops are always messing with us. What if Grant had been caught on camera before? Luke tracked down old street cameras near the places Grant frequented and convinced a tech-savvy volunteer to help him retrieve the footage. What they found made his blood run cold. The first tape showed Grant planting drugs on a homeless teenager. The second showed him taking cash from a known drug dealer. But it was the third tape, the one now playing in the courtroom, that changed everything. As Luke stood in the witness box, staring down the man who had tried to destroy him, he felt a surge of hope. But he knew this was only the beginning. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. Jasmine stood there, out of breath, clutching a laptop. "Luke," she shouted, "I found something else. You need to see this right now." The crowd turned, whispers buzzing like static. "What is it?" the judge demanded, her tone sharp. Jasmine held up the laptop. "Proof that he's been doing this for years." The room erupted once more as the bailiff rushed to bring Jasmine forward. Luke locked eyes with Grant, who was no longer sneering but pale and shaking. And then, with a quiet resolve, Luke said, "Play it." The laptop screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow over the courtroom. Everyone leaned forward, watching in silence, waiting for what Jasmine had found. Luke's heart raced in his chest as the first image appeared on the screen. It was grainy, from an old street camera, but the scene was unmistakable. Officer Grant, standing in the shadows of an alleyway, was talking to a young girl, no older than 15. She looked scared, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "Do you want to make it out of here in one piece?" Grant's voice, low and threatening, came through the speakers, and the room went eerily still. The young girl nodded, her face pale. "Good. You'll do as I say, and we won't have any problems." Then, Grant's hand moved into his pocket. When it emerged, he was holding a small packet of what appeared to be drugs. He handed it to the girl, whispering something that was too faint to hear, but the look on her face said it all. She was terrified. Luke couldn't watch any longer. He turned his head away, his stomach churning. He'd seen enough of Grant's cruelty, but seeing it all unfold like this, knowing the girl was just one of many victims, hit harder than anything he had ever imagined. But the worst part was yet to come. Jasmine clicked a button, and the footage changed. This time, the camera angle was different close up. The girl had left the alley, and Grant was now in the middle of a busy street. He was talking to another officer, a new face, one Luke hadn't seen before. The new officer was handing over a thick envelope stuffed with cash. The two men exchanged brief words. Then Grant took the envelope and shoved it into his jacket. "Looks like he's been taking bribes," Jasmine whispered, her voice barely audible above the gasps filling the room. "Every time he plans something, he gets paid. But that's not all." Jasmine clicked once more, and the final piece of footage appeared. The camera angle was shaky, as though it had been filmed in a hurry. It was clear that whoever had recorded it was trying to remain unnoticed. This time, Luke's breath caught in his throat. It was a video of Officer Grant, but he wasn't alone. He was standing in front of a building, handing a stack of cash to a man in a black suit. The man took the money without hesitation, then passed Grant a small package in return. Grant tucked the package into his jacket. "This'll shut him up for good," he said, looking around nervously. The camera zoomed in on the package in Grant's hand. It was wrapped tightly in brown paper, the contents unknown. "Shut who up?" Luke muttered under his breath, but Jasmine wasn't listening. She was staring at the screen, her face pale, her hand trembling. Do you think he killed someone?" Luke whispered. Jasmine didn't answer. She simply clicked the play button again, but this time the video froze. She leaned forward, her eyes wide. "It's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Grant. He's talking about Luke." The footage shifted to another street camera, this time showing Officer Grant walking towards a bench where Luke had been sitting earlier that week. The timestamp read 2 days ago. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He remembered sitting there, exhausted and cold, as he watched the world move around him. He had felt someone's eyes on him, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, the sight of Grant walking up to him, the gleam in his eye, sent a chill down Luke's spine. "I need you to stay out of this, kid," Grant had said, his voice low and menacing. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you keep poking around." Luke's heart hammered in his chest as the conversation continued. Grant had threatened him before, but now it was clear. He wasn't just trying to scare Luke. He was sending a message. "Get the hell out of here, or else," Grant had spat. "You've got no family, no friends. You're nothing." Luke's throat tightened. He had thought about running, disappearing, but he couldn't. Not with everything that was at stake. As the footage played on, the sound of Grant's voice seemed to echo in Luke's head. The man was dangerous. He was willing to do whatever it took to make Luke disappear. And yet, here he was standing in a courtroom, fighting for justice. The judge slammed her gavel down, pulling everyone's attention back to the present. "This is enough," she cried, her voice trembling with outrage. "Officer Grant, you are hereby charged with abuse of power, bribery, and obstruction of justice. You are to be held in custody until further notice." Grant's face turned an unnatural shade of pale. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He was shaking, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The defense attorney stood beside him, his face grim, knowing there was no way to spin this. The room buzzed with disbelief as the verdict echoed through the air. The case was far from over, but it felt like a victory. Luke couldn't help but feel a small surge of triumph. He had made it this far, but the feeling was short-lived. As the bailiff moved to escort Grant out of the courtroom, Luke's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. It was a message from Jasmine. "Luke, don't trust anyone. They're watching." Before Luke could react, the door to the courtroom opened, and a man in a black suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't belong here, and something told Luke that this man wasn't just another lawyer. He was someone much more dangerous. The room fell silent again as the man locked eyes with Luke. And then, in the dead silence that followed, the stranger smiled. Luke's heart hammered in his chest as the man in the black suit stepped further into the courtroom. His every movement seemed calculated, deliberate. He wasn't like anyone else in the room, and something about him felt wrong, like a shadow that had slipped into the light. The crowd parted as the man walked past the defense table. His cold, calculating gaze scanned the room, but it landed on Luke like a predator locking onto its prey. He didn't look like a lawyer, and he didn't look like a cop. In fact, Luke couldn't place him at all. His sharp features and perfectly tailored suit made him look like someone who belonged in a high-rise office, not a courtroom. Grant, still sitting in the defendant's chair, glanced nervously at the newcomer. The man didn't even acknowledge him, just kept walking toward Luke. "Who the hell is that?" Luke muttered, his voice low, but Jasmine heard him. She pulled at his sleeve urgently. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. I've never seen him before, and that smile, it's not a good sign," she whispered, her face tense. "Something's going down, Luke." Luke nodded, his stomach twisting into knots. He'd been through too much already to let his guard down now. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The stranger stopped at the end of the aisle, just a few feet from Luke. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The man didn't speak immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though appraising Luke like he was some kind of possession to be examined. The silence stretched on. "Luke Walters," the man finally said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something dangerous underneath. His accent was hard to place, but it was smooth, almost calculated. "I've been waiting to meet you." Luke swallowed hard, his palms sweaty. He wanted to stand up, but his legs felt weak. This man wasn't just dangerous. He was confident, almost like he knew exactly what would happen next. "Who are you?" Luke asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but it wavered. The stranger smiled again, the expression almost predatory. "Someone who can make all of this go away," he said, his words like a threat wrapped in an offer. "You don't have to be involved in this. You don't have to be the one who exposes Grant and his little operation. You can walk away, live your life, and I'll make sure you stay safe. No more threats. No more hiding." Luke could feel the weight of the stranger's words pressing down on him. It was a tempting offer. For a second, his mind flashed to the weeks he'd spent on the run, hiding in dark corners of the city, always looking over his shoulder. He could walk away from all of this, leave the fight behind, and go back to being just another invisible kid in a crowded city. But then he thought of Jasmine, the other kids who had gone missing, and everything that had happened to get him here. He couldn't just let it go. "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said, his voice firm despite the tension running through his body. "I'm not running away from this." The stranger's eyes darkened, his smile disappearing. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice soft but full of menace. "Because running away is the easy part, Luke. The hard part is living with the consequences." Luke stood his ground, refusing to look away. "I've already seen the consequences. You can't scare me." For a moment, the man's face seemed to harden, his expression turning cold and unreadable. "We'll see about that." Before Luke could respond, the man turned and walked briskly toward the exit, his sharp steps echoing in the courtroom. The moment he reached the door, he glanced back at Luke over his shoulder. "Think about it," he said, his voice chilling. "You don't want to get involved with people who don't care about playing fair." Then, without another word, he stepped out of the courtroom, the doors swinging closed behind him. The room remained silent for a few seconds before chaos erupted. The judge quickly banged her gavel, demanding order. The reporters began firing questions, trying to get any information about the stranger, but nobody had answers. Luke's mind raced. Who was that man? And why had he singled him out? What did he mean by playing fair? Jasmine, her face pale, grabbed his arm. "Luke, we need to go. This isn't over. That guy, whoever he is, he's bad news." "I know," Luke muttered, still in a daze. "But I can't just walk away. Not after everything that's happened." Jasmine looked at him with a mix of worry and respect. "You're brave, Luke. But sometimes bravery doesn't always win. Sometimes you got to be smart about this. We're dealing with more than just Grant here. This guy, I don't know who he is, but I'm sure he's dangerous." Luke didn't argue. He knew Jasmine was right. This wasn't just about Grant anymore. Something bigger was happening, and he had to be ready for it. But he couldn't let fear control him, not when he was so close to bringing the truth to light. The trial continued, but Luke's thoughts kept returning to the man in the black suit. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd see him. In fact, he could feel in his gut that this was just the beginning of something much worse. Later that night, as Luke lay in the shelter, trying to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His instincts told him someone was out there, keeping tabs on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of the trees outside seemed to trigger his fight-or-flight response. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I know where you are. You won't be safe for long." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Chapter 4. Luke's breath caught in his throat as the phone screen glowed with the chilling message. His hands trembled, and for a moment, he was frozen, staring at the words as though hoping they would disappear. But they didn't. The message was real. It was from someone who knew where he was. "I know where you are. You won't be safe for long." His mind raced. Who was sending this? Was it the man in the black suit? Or was it someone even more dangerous? And how did they know where he was? Luke quickly glanced around the shelter, making sure the coast was clear. The place was quiet, just the sound of soft breathing from the other homeless teens who slept nearby. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense that he wasn't alone. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting. He clicked the phone screen, trying to trace the message, but the number was blocked. It had no area code, no identifying information, just a string of numbers. His finger hovered over the reply button, but he hesitated. What if it was a trap? What if responding only made things worse? His mind flickered back to the courtroom, to the man in the black suit. He had seemed so sure of himself, so confident that Luke would just walk away. But Luke hadn't backed down. He had told the stranger he wouldn't run. Now it seemed his resolve was being tested. Before Luke could decide what to do, a loud knock on the door made him jump. His heart raced as he scrambled to silence the phone, hiding it under his pillow. The knock came again, harder this time. "Luke, you in there?" It was Jasmine's voice, quiet but urgent. Relieved, Luke quickly got up and opened the door. Jasmine stepped inside, her face drawn with worry. She glanced around the small, dimly lit room, as though checking to make sure no one was listening. "Someone's after us, Luke," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I just got a call. They know everything. They know who we are, where we've been, even where we're staying." Luke frowned. "Oh, how?" Jasmine's eyes flicked to the phone in his hand. "I don't know, but they've got eyes on us. We've been compromised, Luke. We need to leave. Now." Luke felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Leave? What do you mean?" "We can't just run. We have to finish what we started. The trial." "Forget the trial," Jasmine interrupted. "You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than the trial. They'll stop at nothing to silence us. I've been researching, and I found something. Officer Grant. It's not just him. There's a whole network of people working behind the scenes. He's just the tip of the iceberg." Luke's mind raced. The weight of what Jasmine was saying hit him all at once. "What network? Who are they?" Jasmine bit her lip, then looked him in the eye. "I don't know exactly, but it's huge. I think the man we saw today, the one in the black suit, he's connected to them. And if we don't get out of here, they'll make sure we're gone." Luke shook his head, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had already come so far. He couldn't back down now, not when the truth was within reach. But the fear in Jasmine's eyes made him hesitate. "What if they're right?" he whispered. "What if we can't stop them?" Jasmine's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in her voice. "We can stop them, Luke, but only if we stay one step ahead. Right now, we have no choice. We have to get out of here, lay low for a while. Trust me, I've been digging around, and the more I find, the more I realize we're in way deeper than we thought." Luke hesitated. The pull of the truth, the need to expose Grant and the corruption was too strong. But Jasmine was right. If they didn't leave now, they might never get another chance. "We go for now," Luke said, his voice firm. "But we don't stop. Not until we've got everything." Jasmine nodded, relief flooding her face. "Good. Let's get moving." They quickly gathered what little they had, stuffing their things into their backpacks. Luke took a last look around the shelter, as though trying to memorize every detail, before following Jasmine out into the cold night. The streets outside were quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of traffic, the distant sounds of people going about their business, were strangely absent. It felt like the calm. As they walked, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every rustle of leaves felt like someone's footsteps behind them. But when he glanced over his shoulder, the streets were empty. They moved quickly, taking alleyways and side streets to avoid being seen. Luke didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop, not when they had so many enemies closing in. Jasmine led him to a small, run-down building on the edge of the city. It was a safe house of sorts, a place where they could lay low for a while. But Luke didn't feel safe, not with the sense of dread gnawing at him. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He couldn't shake the thought that someone was waiting for them, lurking in the shadows. As they stepped inside the building, Jasmine closed the door behind them and locked it. She motioned for Luke to sit down, then started pacing. "I've been looking into Officer Grant. He's not just a dirty cop. He's part of something much bigger. This isn't just about him taking bribes or drugs. He's involved in some kind of underground network. I don't know all the details yet, but I will." Luke nodded, trying to absorb everything Jasmine was saying. He felt a deep sense of unease, like something was about to explode, and he was right in the middle of it. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Luke's heart stopped. He and Jasmine froze, staring at each other in terror. Was it the police? Had they already found them? Jasmine's hand flew to her pocket, pulling out a small, concealed weapon. She motioned for Luke to stay quiet. The knock came again, louder this time. Luke's pulse raced. He wasn't ready for whatever was about to happen. He could feel the walls closing in. The door creaked open slowly, and the last person Luke expected to see stepped into the room. It was Officer Grant. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Officer Grant, his mouth going dry. This was the last person he ever expected to show up here, especially not with the way things had been going. The man who had been the source of so much fear, the corrupt cop whose actions had set everything in motion, was now standing at the door, his cold eyes locked on Luke. Grant's usual confident smirk was gone. His face was unreadable, but there was something dangerous in the way he stood. He wasn't here to arrest them. Luke could feel it in the air. This wasn't a routine visit. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes narrowed, the small weapon still in her hand. Luke could tell she was ready for anything, but even she didn't know what to expect from Grant at this moment. "Don't just stand there," Grant said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Luke wasn't sure if he should trust him, but something about the way Grant spoke felt off. It was like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. His usual arrogance was replaced by a quiet, almost desperate tone. "What do you want?" Luke asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound calm. He could hear the tremor in his words, but he didn't care. He needed to know what Grant was doing here. Grant hesitated, his eyes flicking between Luke and Jasmine. There was something almost apologetic in his expression, but it didn't seem real. Luke didn't buy it. The man had shown time and time again that he was capable of anything but honesty. "You're in danger," Grant said, his voice softer now, almost like he was warning them. "And I'm not just talking about the trial. There are people out there, bigger than me, bigger than anything you've dealt with so far. If you stay in this city, they'll come for you. And when they do, it won't just be your life on the line." Luke's mind raced. Grant was talking like he had no control over what was happening, like he was just another pawn in this twisted game. But Luke knew better. He didn't trust Grant, not for a second. The man might be afraid, but that didn't change the fact that he had been one of the people helping cover up the truth. And now, after everything, he expected Luke to listen to him? "What's going on, Grant?" Jasmine spoke up, her voice sharp. "Who are you really working for? What do you mean there are people bigger than you? You're a cop. You should be the one holding the power, not hiding behind shadows." Grant looked away, as though ashamed. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, almost to himself. "But I got in too deep. They own this city, Luke. They own everything. I thought I could get away with a little side work, taking money, looking the other way, doing favors. But now it's too late. They'll make sure you both disappear before you ever have a chance to expose the truth." Luke felt a rush of anger flood through him, but he quickly suppressed it. He couldn't let his emotions take control. This was bigger than his personal hatred for Grant. "Who are they?" Luke asked, taking a step forward, his voice hard. "Who are the people you're so scared of? And why should we trust you now?" Grant's eyes flickered with uncertainty. For the first time since he had entered the room, Luke saw something that looked like guilt. It was fleeting, but it was there. The hard exterior of the corrupt cop cracked just enough to let a sliver of humanity through. "I can't tell you everything," Grant said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I can help. I know how they operate. I know their methods. And I know what they'll do to you if you stay here. You need to leave, now. Get out of the city. Lay low. If you don't, you'll be dead before the trial even starts." Jasmine exchanged a quick glance with Luke, her expression unreadable. Luke felt a tug of uncertainty, but he knew they didn't have time to waste. "I'm not running," Luke said firmly. "We have a plan. We're exposing them, Grant. We're not backing down." Grant shook his head, looking desperate now. "You don't get it? They'll find you, no matter where you go. They have eyes everywhere. I've seen it. I've been part of it. But I didn't know how far it went until it was too late." There was a long silence as the weight of Grant's words sank in. Luke felt his gut twist. This wasn't just about Grant anymore. It was about the entire system that had been corrupted beyond repair, the network of people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. "Why are you telling us this?" Jasmine asked, suspicion heavy in her tone. "What do you want from us?" Grant hesitated before answering. "I don't want anything," he said quietly, almost regretfully. "I just want to survive. I've seen what they do to people who cross them. They make examples out of you. I can't be their next victim." Luke felt a flicker of doubt. Could Grant really be telling the truth? Or was this just another manipulation to get them to trust him? He couldn't afford to make a mistake. "Not now. We'll think about it," Luke said, trying to sound as composed as possible. "But we're not running. We're going to take them down." Grant's face hardened again, that familiar coldness returning. "Fine," he said, turning to leave. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Before Luke could respond, Grant was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. For a moment, the silence in the room felt deafening. Luke and Jasmine exchanged a look. Both, "Do you think he was telling the truth?" Jasmine asked quietly, her voice filled with doubt. Luke didn't answer right away. He didn't know. But something about the way Grant had looked at him, like he was begging for redemption, but knowing it was already too late, made him feel like there was more to this than just a cop trying to cover his tracks. "I don't know," Luke admitted, his voice low. "But one thing's for sure, we can't back down now. We're closer than ever, Jasmine. We can't let fear stop us. Whatever Grant is involved in, whatever he's trying to protect, we have to expose it." Jasmine nodded slowly. "You're right. We're in this together, Luke. And we're not going to stop until it's over." As they gathered their things, the weight of the next steps hung over them. Grant's warning echoed in Luke's mind, but he couldn't let it paralyze him. They had come too far to turn back now, and with or without Grant's help, they would finish what they started. But little did they know, the danger was closer than they could have ever imagined. The real threat wasn't just the corrupt officers or the underground network. It was the people they trusted most who might turn on them when they least expected it. As Luke and Jasmine left the safe house, a car pulled up down the street, its engine idling. A figure in the back seat watched them intently. This wasn't just a battle for truth anymore. It was a fight for their lives. The car's engine purred softly in the distance as Luke and Jasmine walked briskly away from the safe house. The shadowy figure in the back seat watched them, his features obscured by the dim streetlights. Inside the car, the driver adjusted his rearview mirror, glancing back at the man. "They're on the move," the driver muttered. "Do we follow?" The man in the back didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on Luke and Jasmine, tracking their every step. Finally, he nodded, his voice low and cold. "Yes, but keep your distance. We don't want to spook them just yet." The car pulled away from the curb, its headlights off, trailing Luke and Jasmine from a safe distance. Luke glanced over his shoulder, the unease in his gut growing stronger with every step. The streets were too quiet, too empty. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them, even though he hadn't seen anyone. "Do you feel that?" Luke whispered to Jasmine. She nodded without looking back. "Yeah, we're not alone." They kept walking, picking up the pace but trying not to make it obvious. Luke's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. They couldn't go back to the shelter. It was too exposed. And they couldn't head to the courthouse or the advocacy group's office. Those places would be the first to get hit if whoever was after them decided to make a move. "We need to find somewhere to lay low," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the tension. "Somewhere they won't expect." "Like where?" Luke asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We don't have anywhere left to go." Jasmine thought for a moment, then pulled him into an alleyway, pressing her back against the wall as she peeked around the corner. "There's an old warehouse near the docks," she said quietly. "It's abandoned. No one goes there anymore, not even the other street kids. It's our best shot." Luke hesitated. The docks were far, and the warehouse sounded like the kind of place that could turn into a trap. But he didn't have a better idea, and Jasmine's instincts had saved them more than once already. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." They slipped through the alleyways, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The feeling of being watched never left Luke, and every time he glanced back, he thought he saw movement in the distance. But whoever was following them was good. Too good. They stayed just out of sight, close enough to track but far enough to avoid detection. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking structure of metal and concrete, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. It looked as lifeless as the rest of the docks. "This is it," Jasmine said, leading the way. She pushed open a side door, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was dark and cold. Broken machinery and piles of debris were scattered across the floor, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the vast space. It wasn't exactly safe, but it was better than being out in the open. "We'll rest here for a while," Jasmine said, setting her backpack down. Just long enough to figure out our next move? Luke nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. The warehouse was quiet, but it felt like the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Outside, the car pulled to a stop a few blocks away. The man in the back seat stepped out, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the area. He turned to the driver, his face a mask of calm control. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll handle this myself." The driver nodded, watching as the man disappeared into the shadows, moving with an unsettling grace. Inside the warehouse, Luke and Jasmine sat huddled together, their backs against the wall. Jasmine was going over her notes, trying to piece together everything they had learned about Grant and the network he was part of. Luke was staring at his phone, still trying to make sense of the cryptic message he had received earlier. "I don't get it," Luke said finally, breaking the silence. "Why warn us if they're just going to come after us anyway? What's the point?" Jasmine didn't look up. "Maybe they're trying to mess with your head. Keep you off balance." Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, it's working." Before Jasmine could respond, there was a noise, a faint creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" Luke whispered. Jasmine nodded, her hand moving to the small weapon she kept hidden in her jacket. "We're not alone." They stayed perfectly still, listening. The creak came again, closer this time. Luke's heart was pounding so hard he was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then, a voice echoed through the warehouse, smooth and controlled. "You've been causing quite a bit of trouble, Luke." Luke's blood turned to ice. He recognized the voice immediately. It was the man in the black suit. "Come out," the man called, his tone calm but commanding. "We need to talk." Jasmine motioned for Luke to stay quiet, but he could see the fear in her eyes. They both knew this wasn't going to end well. Footsteps echoed through the warehouse as the man moved closer. "You think you're safe here? You think hiding in the shadows will protect you? You're wrong." Luke's hands balled into fists. He didn't know what to do. They were cornered, and the man was getting closer with every second. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered to life, flooding the warehouse with harsh, fluorescent light. Luke blinked against the brightness, his eyes adjusting just in time to see the man standing in the center of the room, a gun in his hand. He smiled that same cold, predatory smile Luke had seen in the courtroom. "Let's make this simple," he said, pointing the gun at Luke. "You come with me quietly, or your friend doesn't make it out of here alive." Luke's stomach dropped. The man wasn't bluffing. He could see it in his eyes. This was someone who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. Jasmine stepped in front of Luke, her weapon drawn. "You're not taking him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The man chuckled, lowering the gun slightly. "Brave," he said, "but bravery only gets you so far." And then, in one swift motion, he raised the gun again and fired. The deafening sound of the gunshot echoed through the warehouse, followed by a scream. The gunshot echoed through the cavernous warehouse, a sharp, deafening crack that seemed to freeze time. Luke's ears rang as he dropped to the floor, his heart pounding in terror. Jasmine stumbled back, her weapon slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. Blood seeped through her sleeve where the bullet had grazed her arm, and she pressed her hand tightly to the wound, gritting her teeth in pain. "Jasmine!" Luke cried, crawling to her side. His hands trembled as he tried to help her. "I'm fine," she hissed, though her face was pale and her voice strained. "Just a scratch." The man in the black suit stepped closer, the gun still trained on them, his expression calm and detached, as though he hadn't just fired a shot. He gestured with the weapon, signaling Luke to stand. "This is your last chance," the man said, his voice low and steady. "You come with me now, or I'll make sure the next one doesn't miss." Luke's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to protect Jasmine, to do something. But what could he do? The man was in control, and Luke felt powerless. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a plan, anything to turn the tide. Before Luke could speak, Jasmine's hand shot out, grabbing the small weapon she dropped. She pointed it at the man, her movements quick despite the pain in her arm. "Drop it," she ordered, her voice sharp and unyielding. The man froze, his eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty on his face. He seemed to weigh his options, calculating whether Jasmine would actually pull the trigger. "You don't want to do that," he said calmly. "Think about what happens if you miss. You won't get another chance. Try me." Jasmine shot back, her finger hovering over the trigger. The standoff stretched on, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Luke's eyes darted between Jasmine and the man, his mind racing for a way to defuse the situation. He knew Jasmine was fearless, but he also knew the man wouldn't hesitate to kill them both if given the chance. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Luke spotted a stack of metal pipes leaning against the wall. They were precariously balanced, just one good shove away from toppling over. An idea began to form in his mind, risky, but their only chance. He nudged Jasmine subtly, signaling her to keep the man distracted. She didn't respond, but he could tell she understood. "You think you're untouchable," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the blood dripping from her arm. "But you're just a puppet, aren't you? Someone's pulling your strings." The man's eyes narrowed further, his grip tightening on the gun. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Jasmine continued, her voice laced with defiance. "You're scared. That's why you're here, isn't it? They sent you because they're afraid we'll expose them." Luke used the distraction to inch closer to the stack of pipes, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze shifting between Jasmine and himself, but he didn't dare look up. "You talk too much," the man snapped, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. He raised the gun, aiming directly at Jasmine's chest. "Let's see how brave you are when—" Luke lunged, slamming his body into the pipes with all his strength. The metal clanged loudly as it toppled over, crashing onto the man before he could react. He cried out in surprise, the gun slipping from his hand and skidding across the floor. "Now!" Jasmine yelled, scrambling to her feet despite her injury. She grabbed Luke's arm, pulling him toward the nearest exit. The man was already struggling to free himself from the tangle of pipes, his curses echoing through the warehouse. Luke grabbed the gun as they ran past, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He didn't know how to use it, but having it made him feel a little less helpless. They burst out into the night, the cold air hitting them like a slap. Jasmine clutched her bleeding arm, her face twisted in pain, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, they could hear the sound of the man shouting, the scrape of metal as he pushed the pipes off himself. "This way!" Jasmine yelled, leading Luke toward the docks. They sprinted along the edge of the water, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. The docks were eerily quiet, the only sounds the lapping of waves and their ragged breathing. "Do you think we lost him?" Luke asked, his voice shaking. Jasmine didn't answer. She pulled him toward an old fishing boat tied to the dock. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling and its deck covered in grime. Without hesitation, she climbed aboard, motioning for Luke to follow. "We'll hide here," she said, ducking into the small cabin. "At least until we figure out what to do next." Luke followed her inside, his heart still racing. The cabin was cramped and smelled of salt and mildew, but it was shelter. He set the gun down on a nearby crate, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. Jasmine sank onto a bench, pressing a rag against her arm to stop the bleeding. She winced but managed a weak smile. "Nice work back there," she said. "That was quick thinking." Luke nodded, though he didn't feel like celebrating. "Do you think he'll find us?" Jasmine's expression darkened. "If he works for the people I think he does, he won't stop. We're not safe yet." Luke leaned against the wall, his mind racing. The encounter with the man had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. Whatever network Grant was part of, whoever this man worked for, they had to be stopped. "We can't keep running," Luke said finally. "We need to fight back." Jasmine looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We will," she said. "But we need more than just guts, Luke. We need proof. Enough to take them all down." Before Luke could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the dock outside. They both froze, their eyes widening in alarm. "He found us," Jasmine whispered. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, the cabin door burst open. But it wasn't the man in the black suit. It was someone else entirely. A woman, dressed in dark clothes, her face partially obscured by a scarf. She held a finger to her lips, motioning for them to stay quiet. "I'm here to help," she whispered urgently. "But we need to leave now." "They're coming?" Luke and Jasmine exchanged a quick glance, their confusion evident. But there was no time for questions. They grabbed their things and followed the woman out of the cabin into the night. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The woman moved swiftly, her dark clothing blending into the shadows of the docks as Luke and Jasmine struggled to keep up. Her pace was relentless, but there was an urgency in her every step that made Luke trust her, at least for now. "Who are you?" Jasmine asked, her voice low but sharp. She winced as she pressed her hand harder against her bleeding arm, the makeshift bandage already soaked. The woman glanced back, her face partially visible under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. "Call me Elena," she said curtly. "I'm a friend, but explanations will have to wait. Right now, we need to get as far from here as possible." Luke wasn't sure he believed her. "How do we know you're not with them? You show up out of nowhere, and suddenly we're supposed to trust you." Elena stopped abruptly, turning to face them. Her dark eyes bore into Luke's, filled with an intensity that made him take a step back. "If I were with them, you'd already be dead," she said, her tone icy. "I'm risking my life just being here. So, unless you prefer to wait for that man in the suit to catch up, I suggest you keep moving." Jasmine gave Luke a quick nudge. "She's right. Let's go." Reluctantly, Luke nodded, and they continued to follow Elena through the maze of alleyways and abandoned buildings near the docks. The smell of salt water and oil hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sound of distant waves. Every now and then, Elena would stop, her head snapping toward a noise in the distance, before motioning for them to continue. Finally, they reached a battered van parked in a secluded corner, its windows tinted and its paint faded. Elena opened the back door and gestured for them to get inside. "Get in," she ordered. "I'll explain everything once we're moving." Luke hesitated, but Jasmine climbed in without a second thought, her exhaustion and injury leaving her little choice. After a moment's pause, Luke followed, sliding into the cramped space. Elena shut the door behind them and climbed into the driver's seat. The van roared to life, and they sped off into the night. The silence in the van was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional bump of the road. Jasmine leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed as she tried to ignore the pain in her arm. Luke sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on Elena's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Okay," Luke said finally, breaking the silence. "We're in the van. Now talk. Who are you? And how do you know about us?" Elena's eyes flicked to him in the mirror before returning to the road. "I've been watching you for a while," she said simply. "I'm part of a group that's been trying to expose the same network you're fighting against. When I heard about what happened in the courtroom, I knew you'd need help." "What group?" Jasmine asked, her voice weak but curious. Elena hesitated, then sighed. "We call ourselves the Watch. We're a collective of whistleblowers, journalists, and former insiders who've seen too much and refuse to stay silent. We've been gathering evidence on this network for years, but every time we get close, they find a way to shut us down." Luke leaned forward, his interest piqued despite his skepticism. "And you think we can help you? We're just kids." Elena glanced back at him briefly, a hint of a smile on her lips. "You're more than that, Luke. You've already done what most people wouldn't dare. You've exposed a piece of their operation. That makes you a threat to them, and an ally to us." Jasmine opened her eyes, her brow furrowed. "If you've been watching, then you know about the man in the suit." "Who is he?" Elena's expression darkened. "His name is Victor Crane. He's not a cop, but he works closely with law enforcement. He's an enforcer for the network, a cleaner. When someone becomes a problem, he makes them disappear." Luke's stomach turned. "Why didn't he just kill us back there?" "He had the chance." "Because you're useful," Elena said. "At least for now. The network doesn't kill people unless they have to. It draws too much attention. They'll try to scare you, manipulate you, maybe even bribe you. But if none of that works, then Victor will finish the job." Jasmine sat up straighter, wincing at the movement. "So what do we do? How do we fight back?" Elena's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We hit them where it hurts. Their power comes from their secrets, from the people they control and the systems they've corrupted. If we can expose enough of their operation, the whole thing will collapse. And how do we do that? Luke asked, his voice heavy with doubt. They have everything: money, power, connections. We don't even know where to start. Elena glanced at him again, her eyes filled with determination. You've already started, Luke. The footage you uncovered, the trial, it's all part of the bigger picture. But there's more out there. We just need to find it. Luke sat back, his mind racing. He felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what they were up against. Could they really take down something this big? Or were they just fooling themselves? The van slowed to a stop in front of a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Elena killed the engine and turned to face them. This is a safe house, she said. It's off the grid. No one will find you here. You'll stay here while we regroup and plan our next move. Jasmine nodded, her exhaustion evident. Fine, but we need supplies. And I need medical attention. Elena opened the glove compartment and handed Jasmine a small first aid kit. This will do for now. I'll bring more supplies in the morning. Get some rest. Luke helped Jasmine out of the van, supporting her as they walked toward the building. It was small and unassuming, with boarded-up windows and a faded sign that read Storage Unit Rentals. Inside, it was bare but functional, with a few cots, a table, and some basic amenities. As they settled in, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his mind kept flashing back to Victor Crane's cold smile. You okay? Jasmine asked, noticing his silence. Luke nodded, though it was a lie. Yeah, just tired. But as he lay down on one of the cots, staring up at the cracked ceiling, he couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. The fight was far from over, and the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. In the shadows outside, a figure watched the safe house from a distance, hidden behind a row of trees. A phone glowed faintly in his hand as he sent a single text. They're in the safe house, awaiting orders. The war was just beginning. Inside the safe house, the air was thick with tension. Luke couldn't sleep. He lay on the cot, staring into the darkness, his mind a whirlwind of fear and questions. The faint hum of the city outside felt distant, muffled by the walls that now felt like a thin barrier between safety and danger. Jasmine's quiet groans broke the silence as she tried to clean her wound with the limited supplies Elena had left. Luke sat up, watching her struggle to tie a bandage around her arm. Let me help, he said, getting up and taking the bandage from her. Jasmine sighed but nodded, too tired to argue. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped the bandage around her arm, doing his best to keep it tight but not painful. Thanks, Jasmine muttered, leaning back against the wall. Her face was pale, and the faint glow of the moonlight coming through the boarded-up window made her look even more fragile. You think she's legit? Luke asked, his voice low. Jasmine shrugged. Elena? Maybe. She knows a lot, and she hasn't tried to kill us yet. That's more than I can say for most people we've met lately. Luke managed a weak chuckle, but his unease lingered. What if it's all a setup? What if she's working for them and just trying to make us drop our guard? Jasmine turned her head to look at him, her gaze steady despite her exhaustion. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. Right now, she's the only help we've got. Luke nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. He lay back down, but sleep still wouldn't come. Outside the safe house, the figure watching from the shadows didn't move. The faint glow of his phone screen illuminated his face for a moment as he received another text. Hold your position. Reinforcements are on the way. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and adjusted his stance, his eyes never leaving the building. The next morning, the faint sound of an engine broke the stillness inside the safe house. Luke jolted awake, his heart pounding. He sat up, straining to hear, and noticed Jasmine already on her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the small weapon Elena had left with them. A knock came at the door, 3 short raps, then a pause, then 2 more. It's Elena, a voice called from the other side. Jasmine nodded to Luke, who hesitated before slowly opening the door. Elena stood there, holding a bag of supplies. Her expression was calm but serious, as though she knew exactly how much was at stake. Everything quiet last night? she asked, stepping inside. As quiet as it can be, Jasmine replied, though her tone was laced with suspicion. Any updates on our new friend, Victor? Elena set the bag down on the table, pulling out food, water, and more medical supplies. He's still looking for you, she said bluntly. But he's not working alone. The network has mobilized. They want you gone, and they put a lot of resources into finding you. Luke felt a chill run down his spine. How much time do we have? Not long, Elena admitted. But we have an advantage. They don't know about this place yet, and they're not expecting you to fight back. Jasmine narrowed her eyes. And what exactly is your plan, Elena? Because sitting here waiting for them to find us isn't an option. Elena smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. We're not waiting. We're going to hit them first. Luke blinked, surprised. What do you mean? Elena pulled out a tablet from her bag, setting it on the table. She tapped the screen, and a series of files appeared. Photos, documents, and maps. She pointed to one of the maps, which showed a building in the heart of the city. This is one of their main hubs, she explained. It's disguised as a real estate office, but it's where they manage a lot of their operations, bribes, blackmail, information control. If we can get in and pull their files, we'll have enough evidence to blow this whole thing wide open. Jasmine frowned. And how do we do that without getting ourselves killed? Elena looked at her, her expression serious. We don't have to get in. I do. You two stay here and stay out of sight. No way, Luke said immediately. We're not just sitting here while you put yourself in danger. Elena sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. You don't have the training for this, Luke. I've been doing this for years. I know how to get in and out without being seen. And if something goes wrong, Jasmine challenged. Then what? We're supposed to sit here and wait to get picked off? Elena hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fine, you can come, but you do exactly what I say. No improvising, no heroics. Got it? Luke and Jasmine exchanged a glance, then nodded. The drive to the building was tense. Elena navigated the streets with precision, taking detours and back roads to avoid being followed. Luke sat in the back, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Victor and the network, about the people who were hunting them. He felt like they were walking into a trap, but he also knew they didn't have a choice. When they finally arrived, Elena parked the van a few blocks away, in the shadow of a construction site. She handed Luke and Jasmine small earpieces and motioned for them to follow her. The building was unassuming, its glass windows and sleek design blending in with the other office buildings in the area. But as they approached, Elena pointed out the security cameras and the guards stationed at the entrances. They're not expecting trouble, she whispered. That's our advantage. We go in through the side entrance, bypass the cameras, and head straight for the server room. Once we're in, we download everything we can and get out. Luke's palms were sweaty as they crept closer. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. Elena took the lead, moving with a quiet confidence that was almost unsettling. Jasmine followed closely, her injuries slowing her down slightly, but not enough to stop her. Luke brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously around as he tried to watch for any sign of danger. They made it inside without incident, slipping through the side door and into a dimly lit hallway. Elena motioned for them to stay quiet as she led them toward the server room. But just as they reached the door, a voice rang out behind them. Stop right there. Luke froze, his blood turning to ice. He turned slowly, his worst fears realized as Victor Crane stepped out of the shadows, a gun in his hand and a smirk on his face. You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you? Victor said, his voice dripping with mockery. His eyes flicked to Elena. And you, the infamous watch, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Elena's face hardened, her hand moving toward her sidearm. But Victor raised his gun, his smirk widening. He said, let's not make this messy. You've already lost. Luke's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. They were cornered, and Victor wasn't alone. Two more armed men stepped into the hallway behind him, cutting off their escape. This wasn't just a setback. It was a disaster, and Luke had no idea how they were going to get out alive. The air was heavy with tension as Victor Crane stood before them, his gun steady, his smirk cold and triumphant. Luke's heart pounded as he glanced at Jasmine and Elena. This was it. They were trapped, and Victor knew it. The two armed men flanking him looked just as composed, their weapons aimed squarely at the group. "You've caused quite the mess, Luke," Victor said, his voice smooth and venomous. "I'll admit, you surprised me. Most kids in your position would have run. But you? You dug your heels in, made some noise, and now here we are." Victor's eyes shifted to Elena. "And you, always so self-righteous. Always trying to bring down the big, bad network. You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." Elena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Luke could see the tension in her body, the way her hand hovered near her sidearm. She was waiting for an opening, but Victor wasn't giving her one. "You're not walking out of here," Victor continued, his smirk fading. "You've poked the wrong bear. And now, I'm going to make an example out of you." Luke's mind raced. He couldn't let it end like this. There had to be a way out, some way to turn the tables. His eyes darted to the server room door just behind them. "You think this ends with us?" Luke said, his voice shaking but firm. He stepped forward, drawing Victor's attention. "Even if you kill us, the truth is already out there. People know what you've done. You can't stop it." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Luke, you're so naive. The truth? The truth means nothing without proof. And you're about to lose the only people who can deliver it." Elena moved. In a flash, her hand went for her gun, and she fired. The sharp crack of the shot echoed in the hallway, but Victor was faster. He dodged to the side, the bullet grazing his shoulder, and fired back. Elena dove for cover, the bullet slamming into the wall behind her. Chaos erupted. Jasmine shoved Luke toward the server room door, her face pale but determined. "Go," she shouted, drawing her own weapon to cover him. Luke didn't think. He grabbed the tablet from Elena's bag and scrambled into the server room, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled to lock it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the sound of gunfire filled the air. He could hear Jasmine and Elena shouting, the metallic clang of bullets hitting walls, and Victor barking orders to his men. Luke turned to the server racks, his heart racing. This was their only chance. If he could get the files and send them out, everything they'd been fighting for wouldn't be in vain. He plugged the tablet into the server and pulled up the interface Elena had shown him earlier. His fingers flew across the screen, navigating through encrypted files and bypassing security protocols. The files were there, names, dates, transactions, everything they needed to expose the network. "Hurry, hurry," Luke muttered, his voice trembling. The tablet's progress bar inched forward agonizingly slowly. Outside, the gunfire grew louder. He heard a cry of pain and froze, his stomach twisting. He didn't know if it was Jasmine or Elena, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let their sacrifice be for nothing. The door rattled behind him, and Luke's blood ran cold. Someone was trying to get in. He glanced at the progress bar. It was only at 75%. Not enough. Not yet. The door burst open, and Victor stormed in, his gun raised. Blood dripped from the wound in his shoulder, but his expression was pure fury. "Step away from the server," Victor growled. Luke stood his ground, his body shaking, but his resolve unyielding. "You're too late," he said. "It's already uploading. Everyone's going to know what you've done." Victor's face twisted in anger, and he aimed the gun at Luke. "Then I guess you won't be around to see it." Before he could pull the trigger, there was a deafening bang, and Victor staggered. His eyes widened in shock as he looked down at the blood spreading across his chest. He turned slowly, and behind him stood Jasmine, her face pale and her arms shaking as she held her weapon. Victor collapsed to the ground, his gun clattering away. Jasmine stumbled forward, blood dripping from her bandaged arm. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice weak. Luke nodded, his eyes wide with shock. "The files are almost done," he said. "We just have to hold on." Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. More reinforcements were coming. Jasmine leaned against the server rack, her breath shallow. The tablet dinged, and the progress bar hit 100%. The files were uploaded, sent to dozens of encrypted locations. "It was done. We have to go," Jasmine said, pulling Luke toward the door. They stumbled out of the server room, the hallway littered with debris and blood. Elena was slumped against the wall, injured but alive. She looked up at them, her face a mix of relief and pain. "You did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now we have to get out of here." Together, they helped Elena to her feet and made their way out of the building. The reinforcements were closing in, but Luke knew it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out there, and nothing could stop it now. A week later, the headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Exposed: corruption and murder within law enforcement network. The files Luke had uploaded revealed a web of deceit and crime that reached into the highest levels of power. Arrests were made, and investigations were launched. Luke, Jasmine, and Elena stayed in hiding, watching as the network they had fought so hard to expose began to crumble. It wasn't over. There were still enemies out there, people who would want revenge. But for now, they had won. The truth had prevailed, and the world would never be the same. As Luke looked out the window of their new safe house, he felt a flicker of hope. They had survived. They had made a difference. And no matter what came next, they would keep fighting. Together.